There are moments inside palaces that the public never sees. Moments that happen behind velvet curtains and closed oak doors, in rooms where the air smells like old books and fresh flowers and the kind of silence that only money and power can buy. Moments where the crowns come off and people are just people, afraid, tired, holding on to each other for reasons that have nothing to do with protocol. This is one of those moments. But it began on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, when the sky over London sat low and gray, pressing down on Buckingham Palace the way a hand presses on a bruise. The trees along the Mall had gone bare, their branches thin and black against the pale sky, and the cold had settled into the stones of the palace the way cold always does in old buildings, deeply, personally, like it had always lived there. Kate was not supposed to be there that morning. She had been resting. And her team had arranged it carefully, the way they arranged everything, with precision, with gentleness, with the kind of careful management that surrounds a person who has recently walked through something terrifying. Her recovery from cancer treatment had been slow and non-linear, the way real recovery always is. Some days she felt almost like herself. Other days the exhaustion came in waves so heavy she could barely lift her arms. She had learned to read her own body the way sailors read weather, watching for signs, knowing when to push and when to be still. But that Tuesday, she had insisted on coming. There was a family meeting scheduled, the kind that sounds formal in its name, but is really just the senior royals sitting together in one of the smaller drawing rooms, drinking tea that goes cold before anyone touches it, talking through things that couldn't be handled by email or by staff. These meetings happened a few times a year. They mattered. Kate had not missed one yet. She was not going to start now. She arrived with William at her side, and anyone watching closely would have noticed the particular way he walked next to her, not in front, not behind, but slightly angled toward her, like a parenthesis, like a man prepared to catch something. She was thinner than she had been. Her coat was a deep navy, well-fitted, and when she wore it with the kind of composure that takes real effort. She looked composed. That was the point. Composure was the uniform. King Charles was already in the room when they arrived. He stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the garden, and when he heard them come in, he turned around with the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something. There was warmth in his face. Genuine warmth. Meet the kind that bypasses the formal layer entirely and goes straight to something older and more honest. He crossed the room and embraced William first, then turned to Kate, and for a moment, he simply looked at her. He had been ill himself. They both knew it. His cancer diagnosis had come not long after hers, and there had been a strange, quiet solidarity in that. Two members of the same family, moving through the same terrifying landscape at the same time. Separated by floors and schedules and the constant demands of duty, but connected by something wordless and immediate. The understanding of a body that has turned on itself. The particular exhaustion of treatment. The performance of normalcy over the top of everything. He took both her hands in his. Not a quick greeting. Not a formal press of palms. He held her hands the way people hold things they are afraid of losing, with both of his firmly, as if he was anchoring her to the room. His grip was warm and steady, and Kate felt something in her chest shift. Not collapse, just shift. The way something shifts when someone sees you clearly, when the composure you've been maintaining so carefully is met not with demands or questions, but with simple, solid presence. She did not cry. She wouldn't. But her eyes changed. They stood like that for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do in rooms like that one. William watched from across the room and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some things don't need commentary. Some things are complete in themselves. Then the door opened. Camilla came in the way she always came into rooms, with certainty, with movement, with the energy of a woman who had spent decades learning to take up exactly the right amount of space and had finally mastered it. She was dressed beautifully, as always. Her hair was perfect, but she carried herself with the ease of someone who had long since stopped caring what people thought of her and had arrived at something more durable than approval. She had arrived at herself. She had, over the years, built something real with both William and Kate. It had not been easy. Nothing in that family was easy. But the effort had been made, genuinely, on all sides, and what existed now between them was not performance. It was something earned. She greeted William. She greeted Kate. And then she looked at Charles, her husband, the king, and something passed between them that was private and fast, and only visible to someone paying very close attention. He was still holding Kate's hands. Camilla's expression did not change. Not exactly, but something behind her eyes did. A small, fast movement, like a bird startled in a bush, gone in an instant. And then she smiled, warmly, the way she always did, and moved to the sideboard to organize the tea things that didn't need organizing. The room held its breath. None of this was spoken. None of it would ever be spoken. That was how these things worked inside walls like these, in register shifts and small silences, in the angle of a shoulder and the direction of a gaze, in the things people do with their hands when they don't know where else to put their feelings. Charles finally released Kate's hands. He patted them once, lightly, the way a father does. And then he straightened, and the king came back into his posture, and the moment was officially over. But it wasn't really over. It was just beginning. Because Camilla was now at the far side of the room, arranging teacups that were already arranged, and the set of her back said things her face would never say, and everyone in that room who knew her, and they all knew her, understood that the morning had just quietly divided itself into before and after. Charles moved toward her. She handed him his tea without being asked, because she had always known how he took it, and he accepted it, and their fingers touched briefly at the handle, and that touch was its own language entirely. Outside, the bare trees knocked gently against each other in the wind. The meeting had not yet started. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry to start it. The tea went cold, the way it always did. There were 6 people in the room when the meeting formally began, but the tension occupied the space like a 7th, invisible, solid, sitting in the chair nearest the fire as if it had reserved its spot. The formal agenda was straightforward: upcoming engagements, scheduling conflicts, a charity event that required delicate handling, the kind of operational discussion that sounds simple from the outside and is never simple from the inside. Camilla was the one who raised it first. She had been waiting. Anyone who knew her could see that. She had the patience of someone who had spent a long time learning how to choose her moments, and she chose this one with the precision of a woman who understood that timing in a room like this was everything. She set down her cup, barely touched, and she raised the matter of Kate's appearance schedule for the next quarter. It was framed carefully. Everything in that room was always framed carefully. The framing was this: recovery is ongoing. The public calendar requires certainty. The planning must account for realistic capacity, reasonable points, sensible points, the kind of points that, delivered by someone else in a different room, would have been purely administrative. But this was not a different room, and the morning had already established its own emotional weather, and so the words landed with more weight than their surfaces carried. Kate was seated across from Camilla with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened in the way she had learned to listen. Fully, steadily, without letting anything move in her face that she didn't intend to move. William sat beside her. His jaw had a particular set to it that she recognized. Not anger, not yet. Attention sharpened past its normal edges. Charles was at the head of the table. He heard Camilla out completely. He always heard her out completely. That was one of the things about him that people underestimated, his genuine willingness to listen, even when listening was uncomfortable. He did not interrupt. He did not look at Kate while Camilla spoke, though the effort of not looking was its own kind of statement. When Camilla finished, the room held its breath again. Kate spoke first. She spoke quietly, evenly, in the way she always spoke when she was holding something carefully inside her chest. She said she appreciated the consideration. She said she had been working closely with her medical team, who were best placed to advise on her capacity. She said she had no intention of overcommitting or under-delivering, and that she was grateful for the support the family had shown her throughout her treatment. Every word was correct. Every word was also a door, gently but firmly closed. William put his hand on her knee under the table. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Camilla heard the doors closing. She was too perceptive not to. There was a pause. Not long. Not uncomfortable enough to be noticed by anyone but the people in that room. And then she nodded, acknowledging what had been said in the way diplomatic people acknowledge the end of a negotiation. Gracefully. Without conceding the point, but without pressing it further either. It was Charles who spoke next. He spoke in the tone he used when he was not being the king, but was also entirely the king. A register that his family recognized and the public almost never heard. Warm, but weighted. Casual in its surface, absolute in its substance. He said that Kate's schedule was Kate's to manage. He said it simply, without theater, the way people say things they have already decided, not a discussion point. A statement. Camilla looked at him. There it was again. That fast, private thing behind her eyes. Here was the space between them, the place where two people who love each other can still surprise each other, still arrive somewhere unexpected and have to find their footing. She had not anticipated that. Perhaps she should have. She knew Charles's relationship with his daughter-in-law had deepened through their shared illness, that the months of parallel treatment had built something between them that was quieter and more durable than the formal affection of titles and occasions. She knew it. She had seen it. But knowing a thing and watching it operate in a room in front of you are two different experiences, and the second one has a weight the first one doesn't. She reached for her teacup, set it back down, looked at the window. Charles watched her do this, and he understood it, the way long-married people understand the meanings encoded in small gestures. He did not look away from her. He was steady, present. The way he had been steady and present that morning when he'd held Kate's hands, not choosing between the women he loved, but refusing to let his steadiness become conditional on the temperature of the room. And Kate had been watching all of this from across the table. She was too perceptive herself not to see it. The particular quality of the silence between Charles and Camilla, the way it had weight and direction. She felt something then that she hadn't entirely expected. Not satisfaction. Not victory. There had been no battle, not really. Something more complicated than either of those things. She had been for months in the position of someone who needed things, who needed rest, needed care, a needed space, needed patience. It was a position that sat uncomfortably on a person who had spent years being capable, organized, the one who held the shape of things together. To need, to visibly need, in a family and an institution that had been watching her every expression for a decade, it had cost her something she hadn't yet named. And now here was Charles, holding the line for her. Not with drama, not with pronouncements. Just with the simple weight of his word in a room where his word was the heaviest thing in it. She looked down at the table. The meeting moved on. Other agenda items were covered. Someone made a note. The tea things were cleared. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the bare branches were moving more urgently against the gray sky, making a sound against the window that was almost like knocking. Camilla was the first to move when the meeting ended. She stood and gathered herself with the practiced ease of a woman who had long since mastered the art of exits. And as she passed Kate's chair, she paused, briefly, barely. And she said something low, something intended only for Kate's ears. She said, "I hope you're resting enough. Genuinely." Kate looked up at her. For a moment they were just two women in a cold room, both of them carrying more than they were showing, both of them entirely aware of that fact about each other. Kate said she was. Camilla nodded, moved on, and the thing between them, whatever it was, complex and unresolved and perhaps permanently unresolvable, settled back into its usual place, where it lived between the words they said to each other and not inside them. Charles was watching from across the room. He was still holding his teacup. That evening, Charles sat in his private study with a glass of water he hadn't touched, and a stack of briefing papers he hadn't opened, and he thought about hands. At his own hands, specifically. The way they had reached for Kate's that morning without calculation, the way the gesture had preceded any conscious decision to make it. He was not generally a man who moved without thinking. He had spent 75 years learning to pause, to consider, to act with deliberation. The institution demanded it. His mother had modeled it. He had inherited it like furniture, heavy, well-made, impossible to move without effort. And yet that morning, his hands had moved on their own. He turned this over quietly, the way he turned most things, privately, at some distance from the event, in the late hours when the palace was finally, briefly, something that resembled still. The fire in the study had burned down to coals. A single lamp threw its circle of light across the desk. Outside, the wind had gone quiet, and the garden was dark. And he thought about his daughter-in-law with the particular tenderness that had surprised him, and surprised others who thought they had long since mapped all his emotional geography. He had not always made it easy for her. The early years, the adjustments, the weight of the institution pressing down on a young woman who had chosen to walk into it. He had not always been as present as he might have been. He knew that. He carried it in the quiet way people carry the things they cannot undo, and not with drama, but with a low, steady awareness. The illness had changed something. His illness, her illness. The strange, terrible democracy of a body that stops cooperating. He had sat in treatment rooms thinking about her, knowing she was in treatment rooms of her own, and the knowledge had rearranged something inside him, had made certain things very clear and very simple that had previously seemed complicated. She was family, his family, and she was fighting. That was the whole of it. But he picked up his water glass, set it back down, thought about Camilla. This was its own territory, and he moved through it carefully, with the respect a man owes a long road he has walked with someone in all kinds of weather. Camilla was not a simple woman. She would have been the first to tell you so. She was layered and intelligent, and she had her own history with this family that was not uncomplicated, that had never been uncomplicated, and that had been lived through publicly in ways that would have unmade a lesser person. She had come through it with her humor intact and her backbone intact, and something he could only call grace, though she would have rolled her eyes at the word. He loved her. He loved her in the way you love someone you have chosen repeatedly across decades, through every version of yourself. Not despite complexity, but including it. And yet, he knew what she had done in that meeting. And he knew the framing that had been chosen, the moment that had been selected, the words that had been calibrated. He was not angry about it. Anger would have required surprise, and he was not surprised. Camilla was protective of the things she considered hers, and the king's attention was one of those things, and the king's emotional landscape was another. She protected them the way she protected most things, intelligently, indirectly, with plausible deniability built into every move. And he did not begrudge her it. He understood it. But he had drawn the line. He had drawn it without fanfare and without accusation, and without the kind of confrontation that would have required everyone to acknowledge what was actually happening, which was that this morning had not really been about scheduling. It had never been about scheduling. It had been about something older and more territorial, about the particular difficulty of watching a person you love give something of himself to someone else, even when that someone else is also someone you care about, even when the gift being given is simple human compassion. He understood that too. He just couldn't let it stand. He heard her footsteps in the corridor before he heard the knock. Her particular rhythm, unhurried and familiar, or the sound of 20 years of shared mornings and evenings and everything in between. He said, "Come in," before she knocked. She came in with her own glass of water and the look she wore when she had been thinking carefully for several hours. She sat in the chair across from his desk and tucked one leg beneath her in the way she always did, which he had once found slightly undignified and now found entirely endearing, which was how most things went when you loved someone long enough. And she said, "You know what I was doing today." It was not a question. He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The coals shifted in the fireplace with a small sound like a sigh. She said, "I don't think I was entirely wrong." He said, "You weren't entirely wrong." She looked at him. She said, "But?" He said, "But Kate is not a scheduling problem." And there it was, named. Not with heat, not with accusation, all with the plain and level language of two people who had been honest with each other for long enough that honesty had lost its edges. Kate is not a scheduling problem. 7 words that meant, "I see what you were doing. I understand why. And I need you to understand that it cannot work that way. Not with her. Not now." Camilla looked at the fireplace for a long time. She said, "I know she isn't." He waited. And she said, "I just sometimes feel like the whole world is very concerned with Kate's feelings and nobody thinks to ask about mine." She said it without self-pity. That was the thing about Camilla. She could say the true and difficult thing and still say it with a kind of dry clarity that kept it from becoming complaint. It was a skill. She had been practicing it for years. He got up from his desk. He came around and sat in the chair beside her, not across from her. Beside her, and then he took her hand the way he had taken Kate's that morning. Not briefly, not formally, but with both of his and with the particular steadiness of a man who means it. He said, "I'm asking now." She looked at him. Her eyes were dry and sharp and full of the particular intelligence of a woman who had long since stopped expecting things and was therefore consistently surprised when she got them. She told him. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain or defend or redirect. He just held her hand and listened to the long, accumulated weight of what it had been like. The years of positioning, the careful navigation, the ongoing labor of making a family out of people and circumstances that had not started as a family, the invisible effort of it, the exhaustion of loving people in a fishbowl while the fishbowl's glass remained pointed outward, and the watchers watched and the judgments accumulated like unpaid bills. He said, "I know." And he said, "I'm sorry I haven't said that more." Outside, the wind came back. It moved through the garden with purpose, bending the dark shapes of the hedges, and the windows shook gently in their frames, and the palace settled around them the way old buildings settle, with long, deep sounds, like breathing. 3 days later, Kate was in the garden. She had developed the habit during recovery, not the formal palace gardens with their manicured geometry and their sense of being watched, but the smaller private garden attached to her own residence, the one that nobody photographed, where the paths were slightly uneven and the roses had been allowed to go somewhat wild at the edges, and the whole thing felt less like a statement and more like a place. She walked slowly. She had learned to walk slowly. In the early months of treatment, every movement had been a negotiation, a conversation between her intentions and a body that was not reliably cooperating, and even now, and on the better days, she moved with a deliberateness that had not been there before, not weakness, something more like attention. The awareness that legs carry you and ground exists beneath them and cold air moves in and out of lungs is not a small thing, and it had taken illness to make her feel its size. The message from Camilla had arrived that morning. It was a short message. Camilla's messages were always short. She was not a woman who padded her communication. Her texts had the blunt efficiency of someone who had decided what she wanted to say and then said exactly that and nothing more. The message said, "I wondered if you'd like to have lunch this week. Just us. No agenda." Kate had read it twice. No agenda was doing significant work in those two words. The whole of Tuesday's meeting was in there. The framing, the scheduling discussion, the particular quality of Camilla's voice when she raised it, and then Charles's voice when he closed it down, and the moment in the corridor afterward when Camilla had paused beside her chair and said, "I hope you're resting enough with the kind of care that meant something and the kind of complexity that meant something else." All of it was folded into no agenda like a note inside an envelope. She had replied, "I'd like that." Thursday? Thursday had arrived gray and quiet. Odd with the kind of steady English drizzle that doesn't commit to being rain but doesn't stop either, and they sat in a private dining room at the palace with soup they both actually ate and bread neither of them needed, and a bottle of white wine that Camilla had chosen and Kate had accepted, despite the fact that her relationship with wine was currently a work in progress. They talked about small things first. That was how these conversations always began. With the safe shallows, the children, the upcoming engagements, the small absurdities of palace life that gave both of them material for the dry humor they had over the years, discovered they shared. Camilla made a remark about a recent ceremonial event that was genuinely funny, and Kate laughed, really laughed, not the composed public version but the real one, the one that showed her teeth and took a second to arrive, and Camilla watched it happen with the expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly that. And then they went quiet for a moment in the comfortable way, and Camilla refilled her own glass and looked out the window at the drizzle and said, "I owe you an apology." Kate looked at her. Camilla kept her eyes on the window. She said, "Tuesday was not really about your schedule. You know that." Kate said, "I know." Camilla said, "I've been managing a lot of moving parts for a long time. Charles's health, his work, the public perception of all of it. And sometimes I manage things that aren't mine to manage because it's become a reflex. Because managing things is how I know I'm useful." She said it with the clarity she had, the particular Camilla clarity that was not self-pity and was not performance, but was just the plain truth of a woman who had spent enough years in difficult circumstances to have developed genuine self-knowledge. She said it the way people say things when they have already had the version of this conversation with themselves, alone, in the late hours of an autumn evening, and what they are doing now is simply saying it out loud to the relevant person. Kate was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I understand that more than you might think." Camilla looked at her then, a full look, the kind that comes across a table and doesn't deflect. Kate said, "I spent a year being managed by everyone who loved me. I'm being held carefully like something that might break. There's a particular loneliness to that. People think they're protecting you, but what it feels like from the inside is that nobody trusts you with yourself anymore." She said it evenly, without self-pity. It landed in the room like a stone dropped in water, and both of them watched the rings move outward. Camilla said, "Yes, that's exactly it." And there it was. The thing underneath the thing. Not rivalry, not competition. Then two women sitting with the specific loneliness of being surrounded by love that expresses itself as management, as protection, as carefully framed concern that sometimes forgets to ask what the person at the center of it actually needs. They stayed at the table long past the soup. What they built in that room over the next 2 hours was not the resolution of anything. It was not a clean slate or a new beginning or any of the tidy phrases people use when they want emotional stories to have satisfying shapes. It was something less neat and more real than that. It was the beginning of a different kind of understanding, one that had been arrived at through difficulty and honesty rather than through goodwill alone, which meant it had a foundation that the polite version had never quite had. When Charles found out they'd had lunch, Camilla told him that evening, and simply without editorializing. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good," and meant it with his whole chest. What none of them could fully see yet in those autumn days was the shape of what was being built inside those walls, not the formal architecture of titles and succession and duty. That structure was already built, ancient and enormous, indifferent to the people moving through it. But something else, something smaller and more fragile and, because of that, more valuable. A family that had been assembled from complicated histories and difficult circumstances and genuine human failings, slowly, imperfectly, choosing each other repeatedly in the quiet moments that nobody photographed. Kate walked in her garden in the gray afternoon light, and the roses at the edges were still holding a few late blooms, dark red against the wet green of the overgrown leaves, improbably alive this far into autumn, staying past the season they were supposed to leave. And she stopped beside one of them, touched a petal with the tip of one finger. It was cold and smooth and still attached, still there, still offering whatever a late rose in November has left to offer, which is not perfume, not fullness, not the extravagance of June, but something more concentrated, a kind of stubborn presence, the statement, made in petals, that survival is its own kind of beauty. She stood there for a while in the drizzle, not thinking about anything in particular, just being inside her own body, in her own garden, on an ordinary gray Thursday, alive and present and not performing anything for anyone. Inside the palace, Charles was reading his briefings. Camilla was on the phone, laughing at something. William was reading to the children, doing all the voices. The palace settled around all of them with its long, deep sounds. The drizzle kept falling, and none of them, not one, marked the moment as significant, which is exactly how the most significant moments always go. They don't announce themselves, they just happen quietly, in rooms and gardens, in the space between words and beneath the surface of ordinary days, building something that won't have a name until much later, when someone looks back and realizes, that was when things changed. That Tuesday morning, those hands held firmly, that choice, made without theater, and in a cold room with bare trees outside and tea going cold on the table. The choice that said, she is family, she matters, I am steady, and everything that followed from it, quietly, in the days and weeks and ordinary hours after, the long, unglamorous, necessary work of people choosing to remain close to each other despite everything that makes closeness difficult, which is, in the end, the only story that has ever mattered, in palaces or anywhere else.